Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Monday, April 12th, 2021, and today I've got a little bit of a rant. I guess I'm just going to be kind of talking about some things that we face, sometimes behind the scenes, sometimes out in front. Well, we often run into people more and more lately who support our efforts, either broadly, which doesn't happen real often, or maybe nullification efforts just on a single issue. But yet even though they're on board with the notion, they still come up with reason after reason to not nullify, really excuses to either just not do it at all or maybe kick the can to some other time. So on this episode, I want to share with you what I see as the top 4 most common excuses. I've got one from Team Red, one from Team Blue, one from Team Yellow, and then one that they all do. And I've got some interesting rebuttals from Thomas Jefferson, Samuel and John Adams, and James Otis Jr. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives, all the individual episodes. I include a bunch of links and references for you to read and learn more. I won't have as much reading this time, but I've got a few other episodes that you'll be able to check out. And I publish the individual episode blog post about anywhere from 30 minutes to a couple of hours after the live broadcast is done, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can also find all the different platforms we're on. For example, if you show up one morning and we're missing from one of your favorite mainstream platforms, those are the ones we're, of course, most likely to see us gone from at some point, you'll know all the other so-called alternative or more niche or smaller platforms that we're on. Things like Odyssey.com, Library.tv, Gab TV. We're also on Minds and MeWe and elsewhere, plus Brighteon, BitChute, BitTube, a bunch of them. And then we also have the podcast editions, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, all the rest. And the reviews on those actually really help a lot in getting more people to hear the program, because the algorithm of those platforms, when you act on it, it tells them to show it to more people. And of course, you've got our membership program, and I want to give a quick shout out to just a small handful of people. I just picked them at random who recently signed up as members and put their financial faith behind our work. It's as little as $2 a month. There's Andrew in Tennessee, Charlie in Missouri, Richard in Nebraska, Aaron in Michigan, Carolyn in Maryland, and Angela also in Tennessee. Thank you so much. We couldn't be more grateful for your support. You can find all that information and more, not those names, but all that info about the show and more over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you joining me. And we can allow people another moment or so to get the notification to join us on the live stream. I actually had a little trouble, a little tech issue where I had to start and stop and restart. So hopefully everything's working well and nothing's been disconnected on your end. Hi to MRGF, Mihir, Tim Martin. I appreciate your emails last week in Arizona. Thank you so much. I appreciate your feedback all the time. Dixie Strong, Patricia Dance, Ward Lawrence, good to see you. I haven't seen you on the live show for a while, but I appreciate it. I know you always, you often send some feedback on stuff later in the day, but good to see you, Ward. Rachel, Dan Reed, Josh for Liberty, good to see you, buddy. SAH, Clay Kent, Shane Lackey, Categorical Imperatives, if you're on the right account there. Jane Stetz, Peterson, there's Funky Euphemism, Erwin Havernick, Rob Wood, good to see you as well. I appreciate everyone being here, and I apologize if I missed anybody. I will try to get to some of the live chat questions a little bit later in the episode, or I reply to as many as possible later on in the day or over the week, really. Let's get right to this. First of all, I want to point out that, I did an episode that covers some of this. Some of the opposition to nullification back in April of 2019, almost 2 years ago. Top 5 lies about nullification. It was basically covering an article that Mike Maharrey had done, covering the main objections, really more legally and structurally or constitutionality on nullification. Things like supremacy clause. We talked about John C. Calhoun and James Madison, the Supreme Court, even slavery. And these are some of the reasons that were given as to why we're never supposed to do nullification no matter what, because it's illegal, it's evil, it's racist, it's horrible, all that stuff. I'm not going to get into that in this episode, but I will link to that episode in the show notes because you definitely want to check that out. And I think we'll probably send out an email campaign for those of you on our email newsletter covering that in a little bit more detail, maybe today or sometime this week, just kind of depends. But today instead, I want to cover some of the objections that we get, as I mentioned in the outset, on stuff where we find people who are like, oh yeah, I'm with you on this issue. The federal government shouldn't be doing that. And then when we suggest nullification or it starts moving forward, we get opposition. We call it friendly fire, I guess. Sometimes it's not very friendly at all. In fact, most of the times it is not. But people would expect the support from that end sometimes. And even when they're on board, they just come up with reason after reason as to why they shouldn't do it. And I think the first one that I want to cover comes from Team Red. And the number one opposition there comes from basically cops. And as far as banning, for example, state and local enforcement of federal gun control, which should absolutely be a no-brainer because there is no legal impediment, there is no Supreme Court impediment, there is no constitutional structural impediment to doing this. Literally just saying, you know what, you have your stuff. We may not be able to overturn or count on you to get rid of your own unconstitutional acts, your own gun control measures, but we're not going to participate. We aren't going to help you violate our own people's rights here in our state or our community, in our town. And the number one opposition to this no-brainer activity, and you've heard me talk about this over and over, so I won't get into too much detail about it. The number one opposition really is law enforcement lobby groups, whether it's places like Missouri or Nebraska or Wyoming or Montana, places where you really would not expect that opposition. We don't get opposition from the standard gun control groups, but it's from cops. And they're basically telling us that by banning state and local law enforcement, banning them from participating in gun control enforcement, rather than saying, oh, whew, it makes it a lot easier to support my oath to the Constitution if my boss or my commander or my sergeant can't tell me to go help the feds violate your rights on this gun control measure. Whoa, instead of hearing that, what we're hearing from the law enforcement lobby groups, and we don't hear many on the ground law enforcement officials, sheriffs and things like that doing anything different or saying anything at all, basically they're telling us that this is going to help criminals. It protects criminals, is what we hear over and over and over, to actually ban gun control enforcement. We covered this in some detail in an episode, a special Saturday edition that a lot of people didn't actually see, and I think it's actually pretty good. Garbage in, garbage out. Bad foundations are dangerous to liberty. I encourage you to watch or listen to that episode. I will link to it in the show notes. But my point in bringing that up is that, first of all, well, I've got this other episode I want you to listen to, but also this, while that one was primarily about the right to keep and bear arms and trying to undermine, defeat, resist, and nullify federal acts that violate the Second Amendment, basically every single gun control measure ever passed in Washington, D.C., all the regulations, orders, acts, so-called laws from 1934 going forward, all of it. Doesn't matter what team is given to us. This doesn't just apply. This opposition on Team Red doesn't just come in on the right to keep and bear arms. Basically, it covers every issue that we deal with. If we try to restrict state and local law enforcement from using mass warrantless surveillance, like on facial recognition or drones or license plate tracking systems like ALPRs, if we try to even just require a warrant, we get all kinds of opposition from law enforcement all the time. They don't like being restricted. Civil asset forfeiture, opting out of the federal equitable sharing program, decriminalizing or legalizing a plant, we get that as well. And even hemp, which is now federally legal, in the years leading up to the legalization on a federal level, we were actually able to work with a bunch of organizations and help legalize hemp in, I think it was 17 states at the time, even though the federal government said it was illegal all the time. And in fact, what we would hear from law enforcement lobby groups in these hearings, in committee hearings when bills were being considered to legalize or decriminalize, usually it was legalized on the hemp end, what we would hear, and it was the same thing, state in, state out, always the same argument. If you legalize hemp, you're going to harm their drug enforcement capabilities, because enterprising hemp growers will start planting marijuana in their hemp fields, and therefore the law enforcement will not be able to detect this, and criminals are going to be protected by fields of hemp. Now, we know this was total bullcrap. This was a complete lie, because anyone who has studied this issue or looked into it or actually grown any of these plants, they come in and testify and talk about it and say, no, scientifically, this is garbage. Because if you plant a marijuana plant in the middle of a hemp field, over a very short piece of time, the hemp plant actually eats the marijuana plant, in essence. And that's my way of basically paraphrasing it. And the marijuana plant, when it grows, it has no THC left. So if you wanted to do that, you'd be a stupid criminal drug dealer that you wouldn't be able to pull it off. So this was a total lie, but yet we would hear this in state after state after state. And in fact, and when it comes to opposition to banning gun control enforcement, we hear the same argument. If we don't allow them the ability to enforce federal gun control, they will not be able to prosecute the drug war properly. They like having gun enhancement penalties. Oh, well, that gun is illegal, and we want to lock you up for having too much cannabis or whatever other drug someone may be dealing. And they want to use a federal penalty enhancement on drug crime. So it's always this kind of garbage. And a lot of the people on Team Red think, well, thin blue line, they're not going to tell us. They're taking an oath of the Constitution. They're the good guys. They're on board. But these law enforcement lobby groups are terrible. They hate the Constitution. They're not on board with your liberty. And then Team Red, because they have this kind of, I guess we'll call it an addiction, or they like government by law enforcement lobby. Soon as those groups tell them don't pass this, there's a lot of opposition. So that's the first one that I wanted to cover. But I also wanted to have a response to that from James Otis. And James Otis put it this way. This was in The Rights of British Colonies Asserted and Proved all the way back in 1764. And I think it really hits home on this particular excuse, this particular argument against nullification, that somehow we need unconstitutional acts to catch criminals. He put it this way: it is a clear truth that those who every day barter away other men's liberty will soon care little for their own. And whether it's the backers of the lobby groups or the backers of the legislators who are okay with bartering away liberty, because that's what's happening here. Bartering away the right to keep and bear arms, bartering away the right to grow a plant in your backyard in order to supposedly catch criminals. These people are telling us they're so incompetent at their job that they cannot do their job properly while following the Constitution. That means we should not be bartering with them at all. Maybe they should all just be fired. If we're talking about getting rid of something, we should be talking about getting rid of people who are incapable of doing their job without being on board with federal gun control, for example. James Otis was absolutely right. Those who barter away liberty like this will soon care little for their own. That's the first one. Cops rule by cop. Anyways, number two that I want to get to comes from Team Yellow. And you would think, and these are libertarians for those who don't know, maybe we can call them ANCAPs, but basically no matter what the scenario is, no matter what gets introduced, whatever gets passed or whatever we're working on, we hear that no matter what the strategy, it just doesn't go far enough. Like, it doesn't matter if, for example, we're reducing participation in 80% of the federal equitable sharing program, down from 100% down to 20%. If a piece of legislation will do that, it's a huge step forward, and you get an 80% reduction in law enforcement or government taking people's property without a criminal conviction, basically on the mere suspicion of a crime in many situations, or they charge the property with criminal activity. If it's our 80% reduction, a 50% reduction, it doesn't matter what the number is. We just hear over and over that it doesn't go far enough. It should be 100%. So we're going to oppose this. If it's not everything right away, if we try to ban enforcement, for example, in Montana, House Bill 258 bans state and local enforcement of a new federal gun control, anything that comes on the books from Washington, D.C., starting now and going forward, should the governor sign it. House Bill 258, which was passed by the legislature there this year. And while we wanted to get more, there were some strategic roadblocks which prevented it. Primarily the excuse number one, which is law enforcement lobbied against it. We actually, the people who are in support of that bill, the people who drafted the bill, the people who worked on it, actually made it much broader, but there was huge law enforcement opposition. And rather than just get nothing on the board, they made a deal and said, okay, let's at least get a line in the sand and say we're going to stop enforcing any new federal gun control. And I think that's a good approach. Strategically, you have to take every single step that you can get and build upon that. Now, if that's all they ever do, that would still be an improvement over the status quo, which is law enforcement groups everywhere in the country. They participate in federal state joint task forces. There's somewhere around 500 of them around the country. And they always participate in federal gun control, no matter what they passed in 1934 or in 2034, sometime in the future. They always participate in enforcement with their federal partners. They do logistics. They provide resources. Oftentimes, if there's a warrant served, it's going to be like one federal agent or two federal agents on the scene directing things, and local law enforcement, sheriff or police departments are actually doing the works, kicking down the door, whatever it may be. They do all that effort. And even if they were just to stop on one thing, that is still an improvement over what it is today. But we know that many times once you get something on the board, people who really want to get the right thing done will keep pushing for more in the future, and we have to keep working on that. So we hear this all the time. If you ban new gun control, it's not enough. It's not just saying, I don't want to work on this, but it's, I will oppose it. If you want to legalize a plant, we hear opposition to this from Team Yellow oftentimes because, well, now you've created this tax scheme, for example. I don't want a tax scheme on a product or a plant, but you know what? If you go buy an piece of some kind of alcohol at the store, or you buy gasoline, you're paying all kinds of stupid taxes that shouldn't exist. You're being coerced into that. The businesses are being coerced into being tax collectors. And certainly, we don't hear those same people being consistent and saying, I'm going to stop buying gasoline. I'm not going to participate in this until you legalize it and make it a free market situation. But for example, for some reason, on anything new, it's all or nothing. Now, basically to them, everything is pointless unless it accomplishes 100% of what they want to achieve in one effort, one attempt, all the time. Now, many people, we want more than what's happened. We recognize that something is just a small step, but we know that more needs to be done, and we're not going to say no to getting something positive on the board for liberty. Now, I think about these people very often because they should be the most friendly. They recognize, as we do, that almost everything the federal government does is unconstitutional. Many of them will say the federal government shouldn't even exist as it is today. But if you think about this mental approach, if they applied this to other things in life, they'd have to be really massive failures in life. Because nothing gets accomplished in one fell swoop. To succeed at anything, it takes time, persistence, and effort. I didn't go from 250 pounds some years ago down to 198 in one day. It took years and years and years, and now I've kind of plateaued, and it's going to take more years. If you want to learn woodworking or cooking or playing a piano or recording a podcast. I mean, my podcast skills, I think a year ago were crap compared to the way they are now. And in a year or two, I'm going to look back on these and say, well, you know, dude, you weren't that good. The video quality, the audio quality isn't where it should have been. Your microphone placement needs to be improved. We're all supposed to be striving to improve ourselves over time. And the idea that you're going to get it all done, especially when you're living under the largest government in the history of the world, which has had relentless growth in the last 100 years, and it has consistent growth in the 100 years before that, the idea that you're going to change the minds of the people who are on board with this kind of thing in one piece of legislation and get it done is basically an impossible task. And that brings me to Thomas Jefferson, his great letter to the Reverend Charles Clay, which I've cited many, many times. This was on January 27th, 1790. He said, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches." Not only was he a brilliant philosopher, pretty good gardener, an architect, but he was also an incredible strategist, an incredible tactician for liberty. The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, that we must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. And why? He put it this way. He says it takes time to persuade people to do even what it is for their own good. It takes time. We have to show by example that this small step. Now, we don't want to take a small step just to take a small step. We can do like basically what the Montana Shooting Sports Association did with House Bill 258 in Montana. You go big, And then if you can't get that done, if you come up to a dead end, then you reduce it. And if you start too low, then when you have to reduce it, because you're always going to get opposition no matter what, and then if you reduce it, it's a very kind of difficult gray area, and it takes a lot of work and a lot of understanding over time. If you go too big, you may not even get it heard. If you go too small, you end up with nothing. So there's a really, really difficult understanding of how that plays out. And I don't want to dictate or try to tell people what they need to. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I want to tell people what they need to do. But I can understand with people who are experienced and working very hard and have very positive goals, I may offer them some advice on where they can go more aggressively or go a little softer, but I think they're going to understand in their own community, their own state, what's going to be better for them at that point. Again, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches because it takes time to persuade people to do even what is for their own good. That is a pretty timeless truth. And then I think Team Red, Team Yellow, and Team Blue. My favorite one is Team Blue, and that's going to come last. And the third one is we often hear, well, okay, you may ban enforcement of this or that, but they're just going to come in and enforce this anyways. It doesn't matter. Who cares? Why do this? This is a waste of time. So if you ban enforcement on a gun control or plant control or whatever, the feds just roll it. And this is partly true, but it also ignores a very important fact. And here I will just simply cite the National Governors Association. This is a number of years ago during one of these fake so-called shutdowns. They're never real shutdowns. They just do that. Again, fear is the foundation of most or all governments. As John Adams said, most, I say all. But fear is the foundation. They like to scare people about bad things happening if government isn't going to do stuff for us or to us, really. And here's how the National Governors Association put it in one of these shutdowns, or I hate using the term shutdown because it's such a lie. Anyways, they say states are partners with the federal government in implementing most federal programs. We can see how this plays out, for example, in immigration sanctuary policies. We know a lot of people on the right hate these things, but they don't hate them because they don't like the flowery language or their feelings are hurt to learn that San Francisco or Oregon or some other or California as a whole or Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm not sure all the cities off the top of my head, but there's hundreds of them. And they're not offended by something getting passed because it hurts their feelings. They're upset by this because they recognize it actually has a significant impact on the federal government's ability to enforce federal immigration law. And we can either just complain about that or we can learn from it and apply it to other things. We know that ICE every year puts out a report called ERO. This is Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO report. And every year, especially in recent years, they've pointed out at least one time in their report that one of the greatest roadblocks to being able to enforce more fully federal immigration law is the fact that there's an increasing number of jurisdictions, in their words, there's an increasing number of jurisdictions that don't participate fully in federal immigration enforcement. So they're actually telling us, ICE is telling us specifically, they can't do as much as they want to do because the local governments are not helping them. They're relying heavily on local enforcement. And this that I have up on the screen here, this is from the National Academy of Sciences, a study done or published in November of this last year, November of 2020, they did a 5-year detailed study of the impact of immigration sanctuary policies on federal enforcement. And they found that there was up to a 50% reduction in deportations of people without a criminal conviction on their record. 50%. And these immigration sanctuaries, they're generally very narrowly tailored. They don't have any criminal penalties for law enforcement that don't comply. They just say you're not going to participate in this, or maybe just this. And even just that, just opting out of enforcement can reduce federal enforcement capability up to 50%, even if it's 10%, 30%. 80%. The reduction is real, and we have to understand there's a dirty little secret, whether it's the ATF, ICE, the DEA, or the EPA. We know that most environmental regulations are enforced by state departments of the environment, or environmental protection agencies or departments. Federal programs almost always are enforced with a partnership with state and local government. And the dirty little secret they don't like us knowing is that partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. But a 30% reduction, let's say you get a 10% reduction in federal gun control enforcement, or you get a 50% reduction in asset forfeiture. That's not the end of the game. We have to understand that the long-range vision, even if we're understanding and using Jefferson's approach of the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, we also have to have our vision as a long-term goal that each inch has to be followed up with a few more. And that brings me to the great Samuel Adams, writing as Candidus in the mouthpiece of the Sons of Liberty, the Boston Gazette, October 14th, 1771. And he put it this way: instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times, more than ever, calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. People who are okay with a 10% reduction, okay, you are our ally at that point. But if you want if you don't want another 10% or another 90, we'll go with you as far as you go, and then you're part of the enemy. Because you're okay with unconstitutional federal acts. You're okay with violations of liberty. And then we'll figure out what to deal with the state level at some point too, because that's got to be dealt with. I don't know if that's really in my purview. Anyways, fortitude and perseverance. We always have to have a long-term vision, even if we're taking small steps for liberty. That's Samuel Adams building on Thomas Jefferson. And then the last one, which I think is my favorite, comes from Team Blue. Their excuse, we can summarize it as, don't do this because it works. I mean, this is no joke. And this is something, I mean, it sounds almost laughable, but I want to go back to one of the great opponents of nullification, the 10th Amendment, the Constitution, the 10th Amendment Center, specifically my friend Tom Woods, not Tom, Tom's not the opponent, but this guy, Ian Millhiser, who worked for many years for the website Think Progress. I forget what liberal think tank or Democrat Party think tank that is actually in support of, but now I think he's a writer for Vox. But he actually put out an article some years ago attacking our work here to undermine and nullify the NSA, which was developing, at least at the time, and I think we'll build up to this again, a lot of support from the left, some mainstream left, and some of the more radical, more progressive left. And here's how the article that he published about, I want to give you a couple pieces from this so you understand the mentality. Beware of libertarians bearing gifts. Why a bipartisan move against the NSA could kill the New Deal. So in other words, don't do this, even though you're on board. And I'll get to his words specifically, because if it works, they're going to be emboldened, that's a pun, and do more on other issues that we care about in the future. In other words, we're going to be on Team NSA, even though we're claiming to oppose them, because we want to keep these other social programs. He says, what does the NSA need if it wants to spy on you? Well, even before legal permission, there's the basics: electricity to run its computers and water to feed the servers that stores the reams of data they acquire. They were talking about our efforts, which we're still working on right now, to turn off resources at the state level, whether it's electricity or snow removal or garbage removal or water in Utah or elsewhere, because without the actual logistical, physical support, they can't operate the facility. It can't run. And without that, the servers are done. They don't have the capability to do it without physical support from the states. And he says this might seem like a good idea to NSA critics unhappy with President Obama's reform proposals, and there were many. And the reason they're publishing this was in January of 2014, is because there was a lot of support at the time from opponents of the NSA, heavily on the left. Going further, here's what our buddy Ian Millhiser has to say. This guy's just a piece of trash. Anyways, in most states, he writes, this would be largely symbolic. The NSA doesn't have installations everywhere, but that wasn't even symbolic, and I don't necessarily want to get into that, but basically the idea was it's a lot easier to get it passed like we did in Michigan, for example, in places without a facility, without an already established contract, because once they have a contract, the opposition is, well, we signed a contract till 2029 or 2050 or something like that. We won't renew if you pass this, but that doesn't actually change the status quo. But we know that the NSA very secretly makes deals, and you generally don't find out about them until years or 6 months after or until they're signed. And so we want to get these on the board in states where there aren't active facilities today as well, because then it bans them from even starting that conversation, starting that negotiation. So it is not just largely symbolic in places where the NSA doesn't have installations. But that just wanted to point that out, Ian. Anyways, but both Washington and Utah house significant NSA facilities, Washington State, and it would actually be quite painful for the agency to move them. He's acknowledging here, he and I think Zach Beauchamp, who wrote this together, they're acknowledging that turning off resources on a state level would be very painful for the NSA. And that's the point of the legislation. But why should they oppose that? He says, if it works, this is really bad. He says, don't doubt for a minute that if the 10th Amendment Center succeeds in establishing a precedent for nullification via power outages, and that's what we're still working on, they will immediately deploy this and similar tactics to implement other parts of their sweeping libertarian agency. Some of their other activities, including bills purporting to nullify federal gun laws, yes, and the Affordable Care Act, yes, as well as a truly surreal proposal to undermine the Federal Reserve by requiring citizens to pay their state taxes in gold or silver. I mean, that might be an interesting explanation, but basically he's saying, like, look, don't ever give these people more power, even if you're on board with something. Don't work with them on a single issue. It's bad because they're not on our team when it comes to gun control and national health care and the Federal Reserve. They're bad, so we want them to fail in everything if we don't agree with them on everything. And this is just an authoritarian pig mindset. Like, can you imagine being at a Thanksgiving dinner with your family and someone doesn't like cranberry sauce? I can't understand that, even though I guess I'm trash for loving canned cranberry sauce. But I love that stuff. Can you imagine if I had to say, like, look, none of you are allowed here unless you go exactly my way. Get out. But this is the mentality that authoritarian pigs have. They want control over anything and everything. They're not okay working with people and finding common ground. They want to treat everyone as enemies unless they're fully on board with their approach. And that's Ian Millhiser. That's much of the left with this mentality. He goes on, he says, so however attractive reigning in the NSA this way might seem, it's a Trojan horse, a legal strategy that has the potential to bring down, big down, he said, bring down the major federal accomplishments liberals most deeply cherish. I mean, again, authoritarian garbage. Don't do this because it works. To me, this kind of an article has always been a green light. If they're opposing it, he wrote some relatively twisted legal arguments. They weren't actually very sound, and I don't think they gained much traction, but he doesn't like the idea because it will work. To me, that's a green light to push as hard as possible on every single one of those issues that he's talking about and more. And I think in response, I've got a couple of interesting quotes that you will appreciate, and this covers, I think, all four of these. First of all, to James Otis Jr., again, he said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. Nothing that destroys liberty, no matter what the reason is. If you're opposing something because it doesn't go far enough and you're just submitting instead of resisting, then you are helping destroy liberty. If you're opposing something because a law enforcement lobby group tells you we need this power, then you are destroying liberty. If you are opposing something because you're living in fear that the feds are going to come and get you anyways, then you are destroying liberty. And if you are opposing something because it works, you are destroying liberty. And that shouldn't be a surprise for people like Ian Millhiser and others. I told you this was going to be a bit of a rant today. Anyways, that makes me sum it up here with John Adams back when he was one of the good guys back in 1763. He was pretty young at the time, and he put it this way: I would quarrel with both parties and with every individual of each before I would subjugate my understanding or prostitute my tongue or pen to either. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you learned something. I hope maybe you just enjoyed hearing me talk about these things. But I think it's important for you guys to understand the types of things that we're working against, the types of things that we face, even in areas where, like even that guy Millhiser, I know I could talk to him and he would be probably in some areas on board with ending things like prohibition or some foreign policy issues or some spying. And we could take small steps, but he's not on board with building coalitions, working with people who could ever do something that he disagrees with. And I think that might be the most evil of all these versions, but it's also the biggest green light. Here's another. Someone said authoritarian. Ben Jones over on Facebook said authoritarians hate to see authority unexercised. That's a good way to put it. EHP Training, good to see you. Says, great show. Ryan Jones, love you, Mike. Nullify and also secession need to be shared as real alternatives. Some quotes. Patricia Dance likes the quotes. And Jane says, thank you. Great rant. M. Gabriel says, this is becoming one of my favorite channels. Man, that is pretty cool. I just like, I thought a couple of years ago, I guess it's almost 3 years ago, that I have all this equipment. I've got friends who do film and things like that. And I've always just been interested in it. I should just start streaming. My great buddy, Robert Scott Bell, who got booted permanently from YouTube and is now streaming live at robertscottbell.com instead on health freedom and things like that. And sometimes he talks about constitutional issues. He just had Michael Badnarik on this last week. And he got booted, but I really loved watching him. I loved him engaging with the chat and being there while the show was broadcast. And I thought, I'm just going to try it. And it's really caught on in many areas. I'm so grateful for you spending the time with me. Let's take a look a little bit more. Another cranberry sauce lover, says Matthew. Man after my own heart. And I'm a dude who eats a lot of organic. I eat a lot of vegan. Sometimes I eat vegan food. Like I'll get a vegan burger and I'll add a piece of pork bacon or some pork belly, and the server will be just really confused what I'm trying to do. But I eat a lot of relatively healthy food. I've got some food allergies and things like that. So for me to eat something like that is almost laughable, but we all have to have our guilty pleasures, is right. Aaron Wright likes authoritarian pig, is right. Ryan Jones talking about decentralized social chat groups like Discord and Telegram. We definitely need to get on both of those. I know Josh for Liberty out there has been pushing me to get us set up on Telegram, and that is definitely one of our high priorities. We're on many of these other ones, We Minds, we're on Gab. We've had a lot of interaction on Gab. At first, I was complaining. I'm like, man, we keep posting stuff about the Constitution on Gab. We've been on there since late 2018. We're a pretty early adopter, but no one was seeming to catch on, but I just consistently kept posting. And now, rather than just posting once a day, we're posting 5-6 times a day, many times during the week. And we're getting some of the most intelligent feedback over there. I think it's pretty cool. There's a lot of, if I scroll through the feed, there's a lot of junk I don't like, just like when I scroll through a feed on Facebook or Twitter or elsewhere. But I can ignore that, which is how it should work. Anyways. Just taking a little bit further, Jay Armstrong says, nullification, a natural constitutional right. Actually, let's just focus on natural right. That's how Thomas Jefferson described it. That's how James Madison described Jefferson's view as well. All admit that nullification is the natural right, the natural remedy. Everyone supported that as a natural right as well. I will look a little further in the live chat. Rob Wood says, always keep your bill strong and record all votes. Of course, you want to keep track of who's doing what. Nothing, almost nothing gets through unscathed. And again, it depends on the strategy in each state. Sometimes you start out at a 10 out of 10. And then you work your way down to an 8 out of 10. And then you have to work the next year to get up to 9. In other places, you can only start out at a 3. I don't know the best strategy in every state for every single issue, but there's so many things to do. There's so many things to nullify. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of federal acts, laws, rules, orders, and regulations on the books. And I would say you'd be comfortable saying 90 to 95% of them never should have existed in the first place, were never authorized by the original legal meaning of the Constitution. So why not, if you're just getting the ball rolling, pick something that might work in the political climate in your area and then build from there. When people learn that the world doesn't end if you legalize blank or if you nullify blank, then you work on something else. And that's very important. And Rob is also very important in actually keeping track of how people are, because so many of these politicians, what they do, and I know Rob has gone through this, they like to grandstand. They like to say, well, we're protecting the Second Amendment, but they're doing everything that they can to oppose efforts to actually protect it in reality. Anyways, and Josh for Liberty says, we got to stay consistent. Don't legitimize their status existence during the process. That's a tough combination. And Josh, I appreciate your feedback and the conversation that we've been having by email on that. It's actually helpful in the way I'm framing things in my head as well. Always need reminders. Anyways, I'm rambling at this point. I'm very grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start. And I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.